Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman Damned. Now, Damned is a graphic novel written by Brain Azzarello, illustrated by Lee Bermejo, and published by DC Comics, but specifically under their new imprint, DC Black Label. Now, Black Label, from what I can tell, seems to be taking the place of Vertigo. Vertigo was an imprint of DC Comics that unfortunately has been discontinued, but it's where DC would publish their more adult-oriented comics, or a lot of their horror and dark fantasy comics were published under Vertigo, stuff like Sandman and Hellblazer. And again, from what I can tell, Black Label seems to be taking the place of Vertigo. Now, Damned was first published as a 3-issue limited series, which was published between 2018 and 2019, but later on all 3 issues were collected into one graphic novel. Now, Batman Damned is a supernatural horror story which features Batman as the main character, as well as several other characters from the DC universe. However, this is specifically set outside of the mainstream continuity. The comic actually acts as a spiritual sequel to Brain Azzarello and Lee Bermejo's 2008 graphic novel, Joker. However, you could easily read this without having to read Joker. Now, the plot of Damned is the Joker has been killed after a battle with Batman, presumably the battle that we saw at the end of the graphic novel Joker, but Batman has no memory of this, so now Batman is trying to figure out who actually killed the Joker, whether it was him or somebody else. And he's getting help from John Constantine, a paranormal investigator / demon hunter. Now, Constantine is a character who was originally created by Alan Moore for Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, but then the character got his own spin-off series, Hellblazer. Now, as I said, this is set outside of the mainstream DC universe, so it's hard to say whether the Constantine in this book has the same backstory as the Constantine from the mainstream Hellblazer comics, but you're kind of left to assume that he does. But it also appears in this story that the Joker has returned, and it turns out that there are dark forces in the spirit world which are conspiring against Batman. And Batman is also having flashbacks to his childhood, but is also seeing visions of the Enchantress, an evil witch possessed by a demon. Now, Batman Damned I thought was a very interesting comic book, but it's a story that you definitely have to make your own interpretation of, especially by the ending. Now, I do have my own interpretation of what's going on in the story and what the story is trying to say, but I really can't get too much into that without getting into spoilers. But the story really does play out like a nightmare, and it almost follows a nightmare logic rather than a linear narrative, almost like a Dario Argento movie in a way. And the story has this real grim, almost nihilistic feel. Even though this is a universe with superheroes, it feels like there's almost no real hope in this universe, because Batman in this story is portrayed as being a very tortured character. Now, to be fair, Batman is a tortured character in the mainstream comics, but this almost takes it to an extreme where you realize that Batman is kind of fucked up. And this really does explore Batman and Bruce Wayne as a character. And since this story is set in its own continuity, you find out that Thomas and Martha Wayne did not have a happy marriage at all. In fact, Thomas Wayne was cheating on his wife. But you find out that Bruce, only being a child, started to blame his mother for all this and actually started to develop a hatred for his mother. Now, John Constantine, in a lot of ways, is sort of the dual protagonist of the story, and he also narrates the story. And this version of Constantine actually seems to be pretty true to the Constantine that we know. I mean, he's an asshole in this story, but he's also an asshole in the mainstream comics as well. Constantine does have a very interesting line at one point in this book where he says that the devil admits what the angels won't. God is insane, and then he goes on to talk about how the act of creation has made God insane. And I think that's a really interesting idea, this idea that what if there's all this evil in the world, not because of the devil, but because what if God is freaking crazy? Also, the character of Deadman, who in the mainstream DC comics was the ghost of a murdered trapeze artist, he plays a pretty big role in this story. However, this version of Deadman appears to be skinned, so maybe that's how he was actually murdered in this timeline. And Swamp Thing actually shows up at one point in this comic, and it's clear that him and Constantine have a long history with each other. Probably not the same history that we saw in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, but probably something very similar. The character of Satana also shows up in this, and the best way I could describe her in this comic is this is almost more of a street version of Satana. You also have Edrican the Demon showing up in here, and I really liked this story's take on Edrican, where he's actually a rapper. Now, it's unclear in the story whether or not his fans actually realize that he's a demon, but I thought that was a really clever take on the character, because Edrican is always rhyming, so it almost makes sense that he would become a rapper. You also have this homeless guy in the story who appears to be some kind of messenger of God, and I didn't find out till later on that this character was supposed to be the Spectre. Now, as I pointed out already, the character of Enchantress is the main villain of the story. Now, I'm not too familiar with this character, but she was the main villain of Suicide Squad, and I will say this version of the character is far more terrifying than the character that showed up in that movie. So again, because this is set in its own universe, some of the characters are very true to how they are in the mainstream DC universe, and some of them are quite different. Now, this comic actually stirred up a bit of controversy when issue number 1 was first published. Because this is a Batman comic very much for adults, there is a scene in this comic where Bruce Wayne is naked, and in the original edition of issue number 1, you saw his penis. And a lot of people lost their freaking minds over that, so now in the scene you can't see it, and it really doesn't affect the story at all. I mean, it's not like his dick was a plot point or something. At the same time, though, I do not like censorship, and this is not a comic for kids. Yes, it's about Batman, and there are a lot of Batman comics that can appeal to kids, but this one is very much written for adults. And as an adult, I can tell you right now, I can handle Batman's dick. But all joking aside, I do recommend Batman Damned, but I recommend it more so if you're a fan of horror comics rather than superhero comics, because this really is a horror take on the Batman mythos. So that was my review on Damned by Brain Azzarello, and bye.